Don't waste rounds on her. She's just here to watch. Those words landed like a folded verdict, and in 3 seconds the line had sorted her into the box they'd already built. Mira stood at the lip of Range Echo 7, with oil under her nails, and a calm that was less modesty than habit. Morning fog hugged the berms. The 600-yard targets hung like coins on a pale sky. The laughter that followed felt ceremonial, an audition of contempt performed for an audience that had already made its mind up. Hands don't lie. Stefan Novak taught Mira that a rifle speaks truth when people do not, how to read wind like a sentence, how to treat every cartridge like a promise. Summers in his whitefish workshop left cedar dust in her hair and a stubbornness in her knuckles. She'd shot under assumed names at long-range matches. Placing against men who never suspected the quiet teenager was doing the math in the mirage. That discipline lived in the scratch inside serial 15847, an M40A5 shelved as backup, and in the faint scar on her thumb where a lathe slipped when she was 12. Staff Sergeant Cole Harlan ran the armory like a small court. He doled match rounds to his chosen shooters and kept his favorites tidy. When Mira stepped up and slid a signed authorization across the cage, Captain Elena Torres's name neat at the top, Harlan's face flattened. He shrugged and set a box of standard ball on the counter. "Administrative error," he said, flat as a gavel. Jenkins laughed. A pail of brass clinked. The ritual was practiced, public, and precise humiliation. Then move on. Edit. To avoid a gap in logic, add Captain Torres had reviewed Mira's Quantico qualifications and signed a temporary authorization. That morning the paperwork was legitimate, even if the ledger hadn't caught up. Mira closed the armory door on their laughter and walked to her truck. Inside a locked crate sat 40 match-grade 7.62 quarter 51 mm rounds, labeled for competition and stowed within regs. She did not flash the label. She did not announce the rifle she'd pick. She checked the bolt, wiped the crown with the careful motion of someone tending an old scar, and loaded 5 rounds into the magazine one by one, each click a deliberate, private litany. A whisper ran the line like wind through flags. Some sneered. A few pretended not to watch but couldn't look away. Corporal Marcus Mac Reyes eased up beside her and set the spotting scope on its tripod. His sister had been brushed aside for the same small reasons. He didn't ask if she was sure. Mira settled onto the mat at lane 8, cheek to stock, the M40A5 under her jaw like an old promise. Breath. Set. The world narrowed to a single crosshair, the metallic tang of spent brass, the ghost of cedar, the soft slap of flags. 90 minutes until Colonel Beckett arrived to observe 90 minutes to turn a private inheritance into public proof. She heard the line breathe in as one. She felt the watch of 1,000 small judgments. Then she closed her eyes for one measured second and opened them on a horizon that would not let her stay invisible. The armory smelled like oil and old metal clean, controlled. A place where inventory meant power. Staff Sergeant Cole Harlan stood behind the cage like a judge behind a bench. Sleeves rolled, eyes narrow and sure. He liked the ritual receipts, signatures, the quiet arithmetic of allotments. It kept things tidy. It kept people in their boxes. Lance Corporal Mira Novak stepped up to the counter with her authorization folded flat in one hand. Captain Elena Torres's name was there. Crisp and institutional. For a breath, Harlan's face didn't change. Then he looked past the paper to what he'd already decided she was. "We don't issue match rounds to support," he said. "Voice final as a closed file," she said. Simply. "This says otherwise." Around them the armory hummed Jenkins' jostling brass. a radio carrying a distant range call, a corporal rubbing his temple like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Harlan's shrug tightened into a smile that had nothing to do with humor. "Administrative error," he said. "Allocations for the relay have already been issued, and S4 hasn't yet processed any morning authorizations," he added, the kind of excuse that sounds official enough to end a conversation. Mira didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her hands stayed steady. The paper was a prop more than a plea. "Captain Torres signed this morning," she said. "I'm authorized." Jenkins snorted, metallic and dismissive. Harlan's eyes flicked to a ledger and a clipboard listing allocation's 14 designated shooters, names circled in ink. With theatrical calm, he placed a box of standard ball on the counter. "We've already issued our allotment," he said. "You can observe. That's your duty." For an edge second, the armory line held its breath. A private shifted, uncomfortable. A veteran 2 bays over looked away as if he'd been asked to witness something he'd rather not see. Corporal Marcus Mac Reyes watched from his opening, fingers worrying the strap on his spotting scope. He'd seen favoritism before, little kingdoms patched together by habit. He stepped forward without fanfare. "I'll spot," he said. Flat. No question, no permission asked. Harlan's laugh was small and dry. "You're making a scene," he said. "Keep it neat." Mira tucked the authorization back into her jacket with a calm that wasn't acceptance so much as calculation. She accepted the box of ball without theatrics. On the way out, she paused, hand on the armory door, and let her eyes run along the rack's rows of labeled boxes, rifles tagged designated, and at the bottom shelf, an older M40A5 with a blank tag serial 5.847, its stock worn. Waiting. Outside, the air hit with dust and cold metal. She walked past the men who'd smiled at her and didn't meet their eyes. In the bed of her truck, a locked crate waited. She popped it open and felt the weight of 40 match-grade 7.62 51 milliliter rounds, sealed, labeled for competition, stowed within regs. She set the box down like it was a small, dangerous altar, back at the cage. Harlan barked orders and smoothed his clipboard, reasserting a world that runs on neat lists, but ledgers don't measure intent. They do not track a woman who has a workshop in her hands or a captain's signature in her pack. The ritual had been observed. The ritual, she knew, would not guarantee the outcome. Across the gate, a black sedan rolled up, an aide scouting the approach. Mira shut the tailgate and looked up at the access road. 90 minutes. 90 minutes is a long time for a ledger to be right. 3 actions, check. Load. Breathe. Mira moved through them like a metronome. The truck bed was a small, sacred room, the locked crate open like a reliquary. The sealed box of 40 match-grade 7.62 51 mm rounds sitting like an accusation against the armory's prejudice. She didn't fumble. Her hands, calloused from years in Mira Novak's shop, found the rifle with the ease of a liturgy. Serial 15847. The M40A5 settled under her palm as if remembering. The world narrowed to a sequence she'd practiced in the dark, not because anyone told her to, but because precision demands ritual. The range breathed around her flags, snapping. The loudspeaker ticking off relays, the low clatter of brass from other firing lines. But attention had a current tonight. Eyes drifted toward Lane 8 more often. Conversations softened where they used to be loud. Word traveled quick on base, faster than paperwork, and a phone photo of the authorization had already made the rounds. Spectacle draws a crowd. Curiosity is cheaper than conscience. Mac set the spotting scope and checked the tripod tension with one short twist, a small gesture that said he'd done this before. He watched her with the guarded look of a man who owed a debt he couldn't name. He kept quiet because this wasn't a stunt. It was a reckoning. When he finally spoke, it was plain and useful. "Wind's shifting at 2 to 3, he said. Not to correct, but to record. Mira's nod was the only permission she needed. 5 rounds. 5 small promises slid into the magazine like beads on a rosary. Each click was private. She did not announce the rounds. The sealed box's label read competition. The law and the ledger were on her side. What ledgers couldn't carry was craft and insistence. Harlan prowled the line in measured steps, palms resting on a clipboard, the posture of a man who policed order. He glanced at lane 8 with the impatience of someone whose neat world had been tilted. There was fury in that look, the slow, surgical kind, because he understood optics and image as well as ballistics. To him. Mira's quiet readiness felt like an affront to the tidy structure he guarded. At 1300 hours, the atmosphere contracted. Commanders walked like clocks. The colonel's car, a dark silhouette on the access road. Radio traffic smeared the edges of attention. Mira breathed through the sights, tasted metallic expectation and cedar in the air, felt her grandfather's voice as a warmth behind her sternum, less a lesson about aim than a rule about not shrinking under pressure. Then a small thing happened, the kind of detail a man who deals only in ordinals and allotments would miss. The first string was called 600 yards, 10 rounds in 10 minutes, 600 walrused prone. 10 rounds. A junior corporal at the scorer's table flagged a minor variance on the 800-yard sight line. The officer frowned and marked a note. It was nothing in isolation. A pencil check that might be erased. On a line like this, nothing is harmless for long. Mira felt the breath of the wind change. No more than a hush and a tilt. She adjusted a half-breath, found the reticle, and let the first shot go. The report was not theatrically loud. It was exactly the sound it needed to be. The spotter's voice counted an impact. The paper target answered with a dark dot, small and certain. The line leaned in. Harlan's clipboard suddenly seemed thin. The colonel's aide glanced up from his phone. What the ledger could not predict was unfolding in real time, a single, precise verdict that could not be filed away. Mira exhaled and cycled the bolt for the next round, knowing the second shot would not only repeat the answer, it would insist on it. The world narrowed again. The spotter whispered corrections. Someone on the line whispered, almost inaudible. "Look at that grouping." She had started a thing that would not stop at a single target. One look through the colonel's scope was all it took. Colonel Beckett didn't blink when he peered at the paper target, but the way his eyes narrowed read like 2 sentences braided together judgment. Then surprise. The spotter called impacts one after another, tight as a stitch, and the small black dots mapped out a pattern that was hard to argue with. Around him the firing line folded inward, mouths closed, shoulders went still, the low cough of someone swallowing somewhere downrange. Harlan thumbed his clipboard as if the numbers on it could be made to agree with what his eyes refused. "Who's spotting for lane 8?" the colonel asked, without looking up. The master sergeant pointed. Beckett stepped over, stooped, and took the spotting scope like a man taking another's truth into his hands. He did not ask why Mira was there. He asked, blunt and flat, "Why is she shooting that grouping?" Harlan launched into the habitual defenses assignments, allotments, training schedules, an old freight train of excuses that ran on the rails of administration. The colonel let them fall like loose paper. He closed his notebook and said, "Report to my office after this." The words landed hard. The ripple after the relay began in small. Bureaucratic noises typed memos, scanned scorecards, a stamped review ticket. S4 pulled allocation logs and cross-checked issue receipts and timestamps, mismatched allotments. multiple corroborated complaints, and a pattern of favored names turned what had been shrugged off into undeniable evidence. The complaint pile that had always been a footnote became a file with edges. The ledger, which Harlan had treated like scripture, suddenly showed margins full of contradiction. Within days, the base moved, not in theatrics but in procedure. Legal opened a formal review. Supply reconciliations traced rounds back to allotment sheets. Interviews corroborated anomalies across multiple relays. The personnel office produced reassignment paperwork that had the procedural finality of a shipping manifest Harlan would report to the recruit depot in San Diego. The man kept his posture as he left. The petty kingdom he'd run stayed tidy, only the map had been redrawn. Mira received a terse order to report to the Marksmanship Training Unit. It read like mercy and correction at once meritorious assignment. Assistant Instructor. Effective immediately. She folded the order and slid it into her pocket the way you put a photograph away small. Formal. Private. The photo that followed was nothing flashy. Colonel Beckett bent over a target. Mira's card flat under his hand. The caption reading Range Echo 7, Perfect 10-10. The image carried a new grammar the colonel's inspection made the score official and public, in a way memos could not. People began to ask quietly for serial 15847. Units submitted forms. Supply logged requests. A request ticket landed on Mac's desk with a circled note, Priority Training Need 15847. The rifle that had been backup became the object people wanted to touch and study. Its worn stock was repaired. Its inside bore the private mark that tied it to a family and a promise. That evening, an old photograph slipped from a supply folder, edges yellowed, corners soft, and someone had tucked a scrap of paper behind it. On the scrap, a single word had been written. Tight and deliberate, interested. The line moved on, but someone had noticed. The ledger had been opened. A whisper had become a trail. The question now was not whether Mira could shoot, everyone had seen that, but what the base would do with the quiet truth that had arrived and could no longer be contained. 3 moments paperwork. A photograph. A quiet classroom decided how the story would be told. The review folder that started as a polite question in S4 did not stay polite for long. S4 pulled allocation logs, cross-checked issue receipts and timestamps, and matched them to a string of corroborated complaints. Repeated mismatches across multiple relays turned a whisper into an audit. What had once been shrugged off as routine became a file with edges and enough weight to move people. The base rearranged itself in quiet, administrative ways. Legal opened a formal review. Supply reconciliations traced rounds back to allotment sheets. Interviews corroborated anomalies that repeated under different names. The personnel office produced reassignment paperwork with the same finality as a shipping manifest Staff Sergeant Cole Harlan would report to the recruit depot in San Diego. He left with his posture intact. The petty kingdom he'd run stayed tidy, but its map had been redrawn. Mira received a terse order, folded in bureaucratic clarity, a meritorious assignment to the Marksmanship Training Unit assistant instructor. Effective immediately. She held the paper against her palm, like a photograph, pressing the creases as if memorizing weight as well as words. It was not triumph, so much as the ledger's correction the system finally had to admit what a scorecard had already shown. The photo they took that afternoon was small and official. Colonel Beckett bent over a target, Mira's scorecard flat beneath his hand, the caption reading Range Echo 7, Perfect 10-10. The image moved through supply emails and the bulletin board. Requests followed. Units submitted tickets asking for hands-on time with serial 15847, the M40A5. The rifle that had been backup became a teaching tool, its worn stock repaired and the inside carved with a single, Private Mark, Novak. The classroom at MTU smelled of marker, coffee, and late afternoons. Mira did not start with doctrine, she told short, lived stories about mirage, about the small arithmetic of wind and distance, about the quiet habit of double-checking a bolt. We call it marksmanship because it's how you hold yourself when the world says you won't. She said on day 1, the Marines leaned in. The 3 women in the front row wrote faster than anyone else. Months later, a trainee from that first class returned with a challenge coin and news she'd made Scout Sniper Basic. She pressed the coin into Mira's hand and said, quietly, "You taught me how to read the wind." Mira smiled, small and heavy, the kind that carries the knowledge debts are paid in other people's stead. At night, when the lights were low and the plywood backdrop looked like a makeshift stage, Mira would run her thumb along the carved letters inside the stock and remember cedar dust and a lathe's tiny danger. People keep their honors in different places, some in plaques, some in quiet promotions. She kept hers where a hand would touch it before a shot, a name, a promise, a proof. They told her to stay in the truck. She left them with a rifle that carried her name and a truth they could no longer ignore.